Okay, and we are live here. I'm Kate Cunningham. We're here at the University of New Mexico. Today we're talking with Reuters correspondent David Alire Garcia. He's going to tell us a little bit about what he does down there in Mexico City, a little bit about sort of day in the life of a reporter down there, and then we have a whole room full of students here with questions for you. So why don't you start with a quick overview, maybe a quick intro of sort of who you are and how you got to where you are now.
Sure. Well, first of all, really nice to be with you and with the students as well. As you know, Kate, I was a reporter, journalist in New Mexico, where I'm from, for, I don't know, 8-9 years or so, at the Albuquerque Journal, at the Santa Fe Reporter, also with KNME and KLUZ, the Univision affiliate, before I came to Mexico City to work with Reuters. It's been 5, almost 6 years that I've been down here, and I am an economics correspondent, kind of like a business correspondent. As you know, as some of your students may know, Reuters, while it does a lot of general news, a lot of politics, a lot of stories that have to do with government or social issues, cultural issues, our real focus is financial news, business news. And I think part of the reason that Reuters has had that focus is because it's a good business model. As many newspapers in the U.S., but not just in the U.S., have had a tough time, with young people in particular not really being accustomed to reading newspapers, certainly not really wanting to pay for a newspaper. I think Reuters and other outlets like Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, have now for a long time realized that there are people who care about the market, who care about prices and all kinds of things that really help investors, to be perfectly honest, and that's basically why an outlet like Reuters has that focus of business news, financial news, because there's a lot of people who are willing to pay for that kind of news. At the same time, though, we do a lot of general news too, which is a lot of fun. I think at least one of the stories I sent you was definitely one of those kinds of stories. But yeah, my day to day is my beat, the areas that I'm kind of responsible for coverage here in Mexico are energy issues. So think oil and gas, renewable energy, electricity, as well as other commodities like corn or sugar or coffee. And again, the kind of economic side of those things, the production, the trade, the imports, exports, prices, where those are going to go. That's, I would say, where I spend maybe 50% of my time is on kind of the business side, the economics of let's say oil and gas. Here in Mexico, as you all may know, there was a big energy reform, a big energy opening really, where Mexico went from a monopoly company, Pemex. For any of you guys who may have come to Mexico, you would have seen just one gas station everywhere, and that brand would be Pemex. Well, over the past 3-4 years, they've opened, their energy sector to all the other companies, Shell and ExxonMobil, Chevron, from the exploration and production of oil and gas to the retail sales, like at gas stations. So that's a big part of my focus, but I get a chance to do all kinds of random other stuff too, like hurricane coverage, other natural disasters, earthquakes, as you all may have seen. A few months ago there were 2 major earthquakes here in Mexico City in particular, and like other people in our bureau, I got plugged into that just because it was a big major story for us. Excuse me. So those are in a nutshell, Kate. I don't know if there's anything in specific you want me to focus on, but that's what I would say. Kind of my world is. It could be. Just a couple hours ago, I had an interview with the president of the main corn farmers association here in Mexico, talking about the price of corn tortillas, which, as you might imagine, is very sensitive here. It's the staple food. Tomorrow I have an interview with a couple oil and gas executives, and then I may move on to stories that have to do with security issues, or I'm always looking to do kind of fun archaeology stories, which is an interest of mine. One of the stories I shared with you guys. I don't know, is that anything else, Kate? That's kind of me in a nutshell here for the past 5 years.
That's great. One thing we want to know was sort of what is a typical day, if you have one, and how do you get started each morning?
Well, like the other correspondents here, I'm definitely, responsible for kind of following my own nose, kind of scheduling my own interviews, coming up with my own story ideas. So I'd say like a typical day, sometimes I'm in the office, sometimes I'm not. It's kind of nice that, you're not, I don't need to tell you, or probably a lot of your students, but most news is not happening in the office. So, my boss, our bureau chief, very much wants us to be out, meeting people, going to check out, events, so I want to say, earlier this week, I went to a big mining conference, for example. Mexico is a very big silver producer, and I do occasionally do stories about metals, precious metals like gold and silver, also copper. So that was 2 days ago. That was pretty much, I went straight from my apartment to kind of a swanky hotel here in Mexico City where, all these mining, executives were, and as well as government officials. A lot of times, going out to the main stock index where there'll either be events or the IPOs, initial public offerings of stocks. That's something we cover a lot. I get plugged into. But there really isn't a typical day. It's one of the nice things about being a journalist is, it's always something new and fresh, and that's one of the things I really like about it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we're working on in the past week or so is deadline writing. And when you and I spoke this weekend, you talked a little bit about sort of how that works at Reuters, and I wondered if you could walk students through what the process is and just how quickly you need to turn around stories on a typical day.
Well, sure. Stories that are really time sensitive. Think about maybe a change in the exchange rate of the Mexican peso, versus the U.S. dollar. If there's some big, event that has happened that has impacted the value of the Mexican peso, that's something where, we're expected to get that out. Usually, the very first version of our story is an alert. We call it internally a snap, but it's basically a story that is one line, that has a source, at the end of it. Maybe it's the stock exchange, maybe it's a company. But the way these deadlines work for us is, as soon as we get the news, and sometimes, the idea is to get this out, within seconds of when we find out that a stock is moved or the exchange rate has moved by a considerable amount. And then after that, we have 5 minutes, as a general rule, to write what we call the urgent. And that's basically a 1 or 2 sentence story, very fast, very quick, with the day of the week, the sourcing, what's new, what's the news here. The Mexican peso gained 1.5% as government officials openly discuss the possibility of NAFTA going away. And then whatever the source is, the economy minister said on Thursday. After that urgent is out, then we have 15 minutes to write the first update. And those updates typically have a quote maybe a little bit of background or context for the story. And again, we have, the urgent goes out, or rather the alert, I should say. 5 minutes later, the urgent, 1 or 2 lines. And then 15 minutes after that, the update. And some stories we will carry to, update, 3 or 4 or 5. If there's for example, last week, there was a presidential election in Costa Rica. And that's a story that, we would be constantly updating. I should mention that our bureau in Mexico City is responsible for coverage in Central America as well. So, presidential races, other big, business stories or things that we really, cover, and we'll take the same, style, alert, urgent, and update with those stories as well. So maybe the alert is, Costa Rica Electoral Council says preliminary winner is Juan Orlando Sanchez. And then that alert goes out, and then 5 minutes later, maybe we have a quote from the Electoral Council saying, that one candidate has won, but that they're still counting, a certain number of ballots, for example. But then we will keep updating that story, over the course of the day, really. Sometimes those stories go to like an update, 6 or 7, constantly adding new information, and also kind of rewriting, recasting, maybe the headline or the lead, in addition to adding, kind of quotes, background, context, or a little bit of the relevant history of, the previous president was barred by law from seeking re-election. But any kind of, relevant details, we'll try to add into those kinds of stories. Let me mention one last thing. So that's kind of our typical breaking news kind of format of how we cover things. We send out an alert, this 1 or 2 line urgent, and then the update. But we also do, enterprise stories or feature stories that don't fit that pattern. Instead, what we do is we send a formal pitch to whoever the right editor is, whether it's the bureau chief in our office, or maybe it's a specialized editor who focuses on the mining sector or the agriculture sector or oil and gas, energy sector. And if the editor kind of gives us, gives me the green light, then we talk about, okay, when can I get you the first draft? What's how much space do I have to work with? Usually our feature stories or enterprise stories are in the range of maybe 600 to 900 words. That may sound like not much, but you'd be surprised how much you can fit into 600 words, 700 words. So those are the 2 kinds of stories that on a day-to-day basis that I do. The breaking news, alert, urgent, update 1, update 2, until there's no more news to be told. And the second variety are these feature stories, which take a different process, but in some ways are similar. You always have to kind of come up with, what's the news that I'm revealing here? What's the headline? What's the lead of the story? What's the nut graph? Why should people care about this story? But anyway, those are the 2 typical kinds of stories that I work on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. Do you have tips for deadline writing? That's one thing we've been struggling with a little bit, is getting going on that.
Well, I probably, like a lot of journalists, deadlines really tend to help me focus my mind. If I know that I have a story due, on a particular day at a particular time, it really helps for me to focus. I think a lot of times, when you're struggling maybe to come up with that first line or that first paragraph or first couple paragraphs, I think sometimes maybe you just have to sort of sit back and think to yourself, what's what's the most interesting thing about the story that I'm working on? What's new? What's the most important piece? Why should people care? And then maybe if you're struggling, play with a few sentences, and don't worry about, okay, maybe this isn't going to be the perfect read or perfect paragraph, to start the story with. But I think I think the other thing that helps with deadline writing is if you do your homework, right? If you do the research that you need to do, if you read up on the subject, maybe of course conducted the interviews that you need for that story. I think a lot of times that helps kind of focus you, so that you're not kind of struggling with, I don't know how to start this story. I don't know what the first few words are. But I think if you have done the homework and you kind of read up on this subject and you know enough to write the story, then I think the key is just to get started, and maybe another thing that I think always helps is to to run your idea, maybe your lead, by a coworker. If you work in a newsroom, that's one of the great things of having coworkers nearby. You can say, hey man, can you come over here and take a look at this lead that I wrote? I'm not sure if it's exactly what I want to say. I think that can help as well.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks for that. I know we've got some questions here, so I'm going to have the students come up and ask their questions. Okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Who's going to go first? Megan, what do you think?
I'll go first.
Okay, Maria's going to go first. So come up here so he can hear you.
Like sit here?
Yeah, please. And you can say your name and say hi or whatever.
Hi, David.
Hello.
My name is Maria Gomez.
Hi, Maria.
So my question for you is, how do you safely do journalism in dangerous places in foreign countries?
It's a great question. It is the fact that there are hotspots in Mexico, and you've got to be careful. You've got to, you can't take real big risks. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Reynosa, Mexico, which maybe some of you know is one of the hotspots here. There is cartel violence there. I should mention that one of the things that I have going for me is that I mostly focus on business and economic stories. We do have a couple reporters in our office who focus on security issues, on the drug cartels. Every once in a while, I get plugged into that. Just a couple of years ago, when El Chapo escaped the second time, a week later, I got sent to Sinaloa, to Culiacan, and to Badiraguato, which is Chapo's hometown. And the basic rules that we follow on an assignment like that is we're supposed to be in our hotel by the time it gets dark. We either rent our own cars, or we have local people that are trustworthy, that we know, that we have a relationship, who help us in terms of on the ground, getting to where we need to go. And I will say that knock on wood, I haven't had any problems. And I've been able to travel all around Mexico, Central America, and I think if you're paying close attention, if you're not hanging around at night, in a place that has a reputation. When I was in Reynosa, my editor, our bureau chief was like, hey, David, go to this conference. It was a conference about shale oil. And I went to the convention center. I went back to my hotel afterwards, and I pretty much stayed in, right? I mean, and there were no problems. So I think, the main key is you have to be careful. You have to be aware of your situation. You have to be with people that are, in terms of the, whether we have a driver on certain assignments. A lot of times, we will be our own drivers. I'll, rent a car, depending on where the assignment is. But I think the main idea is to be, careful, be aware of your situation. And like I said, I don't have to deal with as much as a lot of other people, simply because, what I cover, isn't, the drug war. Every once in a while, I do have to help with stories like that, but on rare occasions. And so, it's something that I think my mom is, very happy about, that I am not on a daily basis or on a regular basis having to go out, to these hotspots, to cover that story, a lot. Just a little bit, and up till now, I've had no problems, knock on wood.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Hey David, how you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing really well. Thank you for asking. My question pertains to the breadth of what you cover. What advice do you have for journalists who are going to be in situations where they cover so many beats? I mean, obviously you're not an economics major. How did you adapt to that role and covering all the other broad spectrum of things?
Well, I think like a lot of things. I think once you start covering a beat, you become kind of an expert over time. It's like a domino effect, right? Maybe you do a couple stories on the oil and gas sector, and maybe then you do a story on the refinery, and then maybe you just do a story on an oil platform, and then maybe you do a story on how gasoline prices work. And I think story by story, you may not be an expert when you start, but the more you do it, the more you kind of read up on a particular topic, the more you talk to people, executives, analysts, other types of officials, government officials, you can't help but absorb that information. And I think the more you do any kind of beat, whether it's NAFTA, trade, whether it's oil and gas stuff like I do a lot of, or commodities, agricultural commodities like corn or coffee, it's pretty surprising how you become your own little expert. Now, I don't think you ever want to get to a place where I know everything. There's nothing I don't know about how the oil and gas sector works, because you're always learning. But I think it's a kind of cumulative effect. The more you focus on whatever the area is, whether it's, in my case, kind of economics, business stories, but say it's fashion, or say it's sports, say it's a particular sport, say it's a particular kind of science, climate change science. I think the more you cover something, the more you're going to know about it, and the more, the better questions you're going to be able to ask of people that you interview. And I think, one thing I mentioned at the start, I think, for young journalists, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to read news. And I would suggest, start with reading news that you like. What are you into, right? Maybe you're not into, the economy, or, how businesses, work, and, maybe it's something else. Like, yeah, maybe it's sports, maybe it's, art, maybe it's science. But I would say, definitely, make it a point to read news, whether it's a newspaper, a guy like me who started out, at the Albuquerque Journal and at the Santa Fe Reporter, it's easy for me to say because I've always liked newspapers. But maybe it's online news, right? Maybe it's whatever news website that maybe you come across a story and you think it's pretty interesting, and you learn something, and you like that. But there's no substitute to reading up on any particular subject that then then you want to cover. You've gotta read, and I shouldn't just say read stories, right? But TV news or podcasts or radio news, all of that is great. There's no substitute to kind of just exposing yourself to news stories, whether it's TV, audio, video, or print. So I would say that those are the main things that come to my mind is be a big consumer of news. Even if that just means in the mornings or when you're having some lunch, maybe on your phone, pull up, your Twitter, or pull up, whatever, RSS feed you like, or just a news website, whether it's the abcjournal.com or whether it's nytimes.com or, I think there's nothing that can, there's no substitute for just consuming news, in terms of kind of preparing yourself to cover news. And even when you're covering news, even a guy like me, I probably spend, I don't know, an hour of every day just reading stories. Reading stories that my colleagues write, reading stories that my competitors write. I have a couple, I call them like my arch rivals. These two reporters here in Mexico City who kind of cover the same stuff I do. And, I have Google alerts on their stories. Whenever they come out with a news story, I get a little Google alert and I read them. And a lot of times I'm like, oh, that was a pretty crappy story, or oh, that was a really good story. Why didn't I get that? Or next time I'm going to get that story. But yeah, I think if you want to cover stories, start with reading up, listening, watching similar stuff, and I bet you ideas will come from that, and you'll get better. Just the more you do it, and the more you are consuming news.
Awesome. That's good advice. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
That definitely answered my question. Woo!
What did you do?
I couldn't take my questioning, I guess.
Hello?
Oh.
We're still here. Are you there?
Looks like I don't know if you guys can still hear me.
So we can hear you. Okay. Ta-da. Okay. You're back. Okay.
Okay. All right.
We've got a couple more questions for you if you still have time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Anthony. I have a quick question. So, do you have any tips for people that want to work with Reuters or an international news agency?
Absolutely. Two things come to mind. One, like I mentioned at the start, one thing that is unique about Reuters, and that's that other outlets are similar, like Bloomberg or like the Wall Street Journal, is that there's a focus on the economy. There's a focus on financial news, on company news. If you or anyone there in the class thinks that might be something of interest, I would say, the first tip would be to think about whether it's the Daily Logo or whether it's a freelance, job that you're able to get. Think about writing, a couple business type stories. I can tell you, if you want to apply at some time in the future for a job with Reuters or those other outlets I mentioned, the editors are going to be looking for your track record, even if it's just a little bit, right? I don't think any editor expects, a young journalist to have, mountains and mountains of clips. But if you can at least have one or two that have to do with the economy, with, I don't know, the unemployment rate there in New Mexico, or, any other kind of sort of story that has a business angle, maybe businesses that are expanding, businesses that are, collapsing. Maybe it has something to do with what the state legislature is doing that maybe would impact positively or negatively a particular kind of business. Whether it's a mining business or who knows what else. So that's one thing. I think even though I think a lot of us are geared toward other stories, other kinds of stories, and I'm right there with you. I mean, there's other kinds of politics stories or sports stories. In my case, I'm a big sports fan that I like to read. But in terms of thinking about whether or not landing a job with an outlet like Reuters, if you can get a little experience of business writing, that is very helpful. The other thing I would say is languages. There's no way that I would have the job that I have today if I didn't speak Spanish. And I can tell you, I don't need to tell you guys, but there's a lot of folks in New Mexico who already have this advantage, right? Whether the mom and dad or grandma and grandpa are, speak Spanish or another language for that matter, that is a huge plus. And for bureaus outside the U.S., but even inside the U.S., immigration is of course a huge story, and I think at most outlets, immigration reporters are going to be, if not bilingual, multilingual. So I would say those two things are what really come to mind. Taking language classes. Maybe your Spanish is okay, or maybe your Portuguese is okay, or French. But if you have a chance to take some classes, or and meanwhile, on Netflix, watch some Spanish language series or French or whatever the case may be, that's going to be a big plus for you, particularly in bureaus like mine, where our primary language day to day is not English, it's Spanish. So those are two things that come to mind. And I would also say, don't hesitate to apply. I mean, I think all of us, you've applied for jobs, and maybe a lot of them, you never get, or but if you just keep trying, you'd be surprised, how much, being tenacious, really, aggressively, trying to apply for jobs, those kind of intangible, elements of just, giving it your best effort, that's, I think, another big part of landing a job in journalism. Maybe one thing I should say, by the way, if, my job is appealing to any of you guys, the other thing that goes without saying is that, starting at a local newspaper or radio station or news website, that's invaluable experience. Like, that teaches you. It's one thing, you guys are obviously, studying journalism, doing exercises that help you prepare for the kind of what the kind of work that you would be doing in an actual job as a reporter. But I even if you would like at some point to work in Mexico City, let's say, or in Sao Paulo in Brazil, or in Rome, or Hong Kong, or wherever the case may be, if you can get experience at a local outlet, for a year, a couple of years, that often is is what hiring editors are looking for. That you have experience, maybe at a smaller outlet, but you come up with some really good stories. You broke some news. You have those clips that you can show. I mean, that's definitely something that all these hiring editors are going to want from you is to see examples of your work. And it's totally okay if those examples of your work are at the Weekly Alibi, or at the the Santa Fe Reporter. And a lot of these outlets, I don't know if you guys talk about this in class, but they do rely on freelance work. So if you can get some of those clips under your belt, and stories that you're proud of, some stories where you've done some good work, and like I said a second ago, a business story would really make a big difference for an outlet like mine, because that's 50% of what we do, I'd say. I think those would be the tips that come to my mind.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Hi. I wanted
Hello.
to ask, what was your career highlight and what did you learn from it?
My career highlight, let's see, good question. I mean, I think it changes, every few months. Every few months I'll have a story that I'm like, wow, that was a really fun story. That was I really enjoyed that for whatever reason. One example that comes to mind is that story that I shared with you guys from a few months ago, last year, about this discovery of an Aztec sacrificial offering. I don't know if you guys got a chance to see that story, but as a guy who, as a little kid, was really interested in, kind of ancient history and the Aztecs, ancient Mexico. The fact that, last, I think it was July, I got a chance to hang out with one of Mexico's leading archaeologists. I had been emailing with him. I had read a couple of his papers, and I said, hey, I would love to come and check out the site that you're working on in downtown Mexico City. Please let me know, when I can come down. And lo and behold, he said, oh, you know what? I think there's something interesting that you might really like to see. How about you come down, on Monday? I go there. I go down, these sort of stairways to get down to this, sort of underground area where they had been digging up these offerings right off of what was once the Aztecs' most important temple, right in the heart of downtown Mexico City. And before my eyes, I see this box on the floor with gold, this shiny, numerous pieces of gold. And I remember thinking to myself when I saw it, I was like, wow, I've got to pinch myself. This is quite a fun story that I'm going to get to work on. I'd probably do it for free, if I didn't have this job. But I'd say stories like that are real highlights for me because, they tap into interests I have, that I've had for a long, long time. I get to kind of read up on the history, and then I think through, okay, how am I going to write my story? That was a multimedia story, by the way, that, Reuters is a bit of a traditional, or maybe old-fashioned news outlet in the sense that we have staff photographers, staff videographers who will go with us, the text reporters like me, to take the photographs that maybe you guys saw in that story, or shoot the video for that story. But I'd say that's like that was a real recent highlight just from from last year. What else? What else? I think maybe the other thing that comes to mind, and really when I hear you say career highlight, I think more, what are the stories that I've enjoyed the most? I got plugged into hurricane, a pretty major hurricane, again last year, in which I got to kind of spend about 3 days driving around the Pacific coast of Mexico, in between Puerto Vallarta and Manzanillo, which is where this massive, Category 4 hurricane struck land. And, I got to, go visit these little villages that, were really affected, homes that were, seriously damaged. In addition to seeing some like super exclusive resorts that were also damaged. In fact, I got a chance to go to the place where Heidi Klum and Seal got married, which is this really exclusive, resort right in the area where this hurricane came across. Maybe one other story I'll mention, and this was a career highlight, but also a story that really affected me. The earthquakes that struck Mexico, that you guys probably maybe saw some of the news. This was very close to home, these earthquakes, because on my very block where I live, where my apartment is, there were buildings that were damaged. Luckily my building was okay. But talking to mothers, young mothers, at this one school in Mexico City that collapsed, and that night I got sent to this school, and my job was to seek out some of the parents of kids that have not been accounted for. It was a really difficult assignment, to have to go talk to these people that were, in their kind of worst possible moment. You've got to, think through how are you going to, have that conversation? What do you say, to see if you can get, these people to talk to you and tell you, they haven't heard anything of where their son or daughter may be. They're waiting on news from the authorities. They're camped out at this site where their kid's school collapsed. Those stories kind of, stay with you because, you're talking to people who, this is not their best moment, right? I mean, they're really struggling and there are tears. So I think stories like that, and there were 2 big earthquakes last year, really stuck with me. Maybe the last example, in the first earthquake, there were 2 big earthquakes late last year. One really struck Mexico City, and another one about 2 weeks earlier struck Oaxaca, Chiapas and Oaxaca in southern Mexico. And I got sent down there, to cover kind of the aftermath of that earthquake. One particular town called Juchitán was most affected, and one of the things that was really interesting about the stories that I wrote from that town was it's an indigenous town, Zapotec town, and maybe similar, maybe you think almost a little bit to the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. But this town is very much a matriarchal town. The women run the show, run the show in this town. And I even talked to women that I interviewed there who were like, women are more important than the men here. We make the decisions. And so it was a real fascinating, a place to be that, unlike Mexico in general, which is very macho, all this machismo, here was a place that just so happened, is right where the earthquake struck, that is a place, that in part because of this indigenous identity has a very matriarchal culture, and that was new to me. I didn't know that, and so I get there, I spend probably a week there, and by the time I come back to Mexico City, I have enough material to write a story about how, in the aftermath of this earthquake, women really, played the major role in terms of, digging out, people, grandparents that the roofs had collapsed on them and digging them out with their bare hands. So that was a fascinating, story in that it just, challenged my, my assumptions of Mexico. But yeah, anyway, I would say those kind of career highlights, I always think of like stories that either surprised me, stories that, were particularly fun or particularly, had an impact on me emotionally. One last story I'll mention is about 3 years ago, I got sent to a tennis tournament, professional tennis tournament here in Mexico, in Acapulco, and I got to interview Rafael Nadal, and I got to do a profile of him. And as a guy who, is a bit of a tennis fan in general, that was a lot of fun. I mean, here's a guy that I had, as a kid, been watching play tennis and win all these tournaments, and then, all of a sudden I got, nothing, it was probably all told a 20-minute interview, but, those are always kind of fun to, stories where you get to talk to maybe people that you've admired, people that you, spent time, following their careers, and the next thing you know, you're kind of there interviewing them. So anyway, those are a few of the stories that come to mind when you ask about career highlights.
Thank you.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes, so we have one last question for you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sanchez, and thank
Hello.
you for coming to our class.
Okay.
Are there any issues that came up while you were in college or while you were first starting out as a reporter that you wish you could fix or you wish you could go back on and resolve? Things that we could all learn from, experiences like that.
Are there things like that I would do differently, or
Yes, things that you would do differently.
Let's see. By the way, and I hope you guys don't take this the wrong way, but I actually never took a journalism class as an undergrad. Can you believe that? I started out, when I was a college student, I started out, kind of doing freelance projects. I like to write. I knew that I liked that. I didn't have any great experience. I started out. I was a political science and economics major, as an undergrad. And in retrospect, that really was good in the sense that nowadays I write a lot about economics and I write a lot about government and politics. And I don't necessarily regret that. And by the way, I don't mean to suggest that in any way that what you guys are doing really. I bet you I'd probably be a better journalist today, frankly, had I, been thinking about these issues that you guys are thinking about, that you guys are working on, different projects that you guys are doing as a part of your journalism class. That just so happened that wasn't my path. I thought I was going to do something else, but I got this bug where I really liked writing. I liked kind of the thought of being playful with words, and how do you describe something, and how do you, and how do you think about interviewing someone to get a nice quote, to be in a story. So I don't regret that I, wasn't a journalism student. I think I'd probably be a better journalist if I had been. But I think it worked out for me. In many ways, the things that I studied, I have a master's degree in public policy, which is kind of a mix of political science and economics, and really those are the things that I do spend a lot of time writing about on a day-to-day basis. I think one thing that I actually am thinking about these days, and if I were in your guys' shoes, I mentioned it to one of the previous students who asked the question, languages. I wish I had taken more languages. I wish I speak a little bit of Portuguese. I wish my Portuguese was a lot better. I wish I spoke French because I could see myself, maybe for a couple of years working in Paris. Big Paris fan. But frankly, my language skills in terms of Portuguese and French aren't where they need to be for me to land one of those jobs right now. So I actually am taking French classes. I started just last month. But I would say, if I had to do over again, I think I would have maybe taken some more writing classes. The more you can practice that sort of stuff, that always helps. I wish I had even kind of more language skills beyond Spanish. So those are a couple things that come to mind. But yeah, please don't think less of me that I actually as a college student wasn't in your guys' shoes in terms of taking journalism classes. But that goes to tell you, by the way, that once you guys graduate, you really it's one thing to learn in the class, and that's very valuable stuff. But in a lot of these jobs, you're going to learn, as you do it. One story at a time, and all that builds on itself. You get better and better, and quicker. And this is a business where time is of the essence in terms of breaking news, and you can't sit on stuff. And a lot of times I think that happens. You learn about that by doing it. Not necessarily any other way. And there's no substitute for that kind of day-to-day experience of, working for, the Daily Logo, or working for, the Metro desk at the Albuquerque Journal, or, maybe one of the, the TV stations. But, the only last thing I would say too is that I think if you can think, kind of think, what are the areas that I'm really interested in? What do I, what really gets me going? What is it? Is it politics? Is it the environment? Is it fashion? Is it sports? Is it business? And I think the more you can, read up on those subjects, see how other journalists write stories about that area that you're interested in, that's going to make you a better, journalist. Once you, get started doing it on a day-to-day basis, really reading up on what your colleagues or what people you admire, are writing, how they're writing, what's that first line and what's the second line, and what is it about that article that you liked, and then maybe when you write an article, maybe you can kind of copy that same structure or that, or kind of adopt a similar, style to something you found that you liked. I would say that that always helped, develop an interest in journalism and find out what it is you like, and sometimes you might be writing stories that aren't the most exciting. Maybe it's a school board meeting or a city council meeting, and sometimes I think forcing yourself to write about or cover something that maybe isn't what you are most excited about, that can be helpful too.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, David. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we do need to leave it there. Everybody's clapping for you, though, and appreciate your time today. And I'll talk to you soon. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.